Buenos dias and welcome everyone to this timely discussion with the President of Colombia, my friend Iván Duque. It's an opportunity to review where Colombia has come from these last several years. More importantly, where President Duque hopes to take the country in the important months that are ahead. I'm Mark Green, President and CEO of the Wilson Center. And the Wilson Center's Latin America program is proud to join with the Inter-American Dialogue in hosting today's important discussion. During my time as administrator of USAID, there was no country that I visited more than Colombia. Some of that was due to our shared challenges. I made 4 trips to the Venezuelan border, and I saw firsthand Colombian generosity towards Venezuelans desperately fleeing Maduro's tyranny. You can see that generosity in President Duque's historic decision to grant temporary protected status to some 1.8 million Venezuelans. But I also visited Colombia because the Duque government is a key partner and ally of the US. Our values, our political, economic, and strategic interests, they overlap in so many ways. To be sure, like any good friend, we're concerned about the events that have unfolded over these last 4 weeks. In many ways, Colombia has been consumed by protests. But we also recognize that these events didn't just emerge overnight. As President Duque was entering office, the government was implementing peace accords with uneven public support. Meanwhile, elements such as the ELN and FARC dissidents were continuing to wage their war against Colombian government and society. In 2018, Nicolas Maduro hijacked Venezuela's elections, and by the end of 2020, an estimated 6 million Venezuelans had fled in desperation, most through Colombia and many still there. Then, of course, came COVID-19, which has taken a terrible toll. Colombia is in the midst of a 3rd deadly wave of infections. It is the 3rd largest number of deaths in Latin America, surpassed only by Brazil and Mexico. And Colombia has openly and urgently sought more help and more vaccine supplies. Like other Latin American countries, Colombia's economy has suffered badly during the pandemic. In 2017, the poverty rate was 27%. COVID boosted that to 46%. Last year, GDP declined by 6.8%. Youth have borne the brunt of those economic losses, and they appear to be making up most of the protesters. The vast majority have been peaceful, but a small number have been extremely violent, causing millions of dollars in damages to key infrastructure and public property. Of greatest concern to us all has been the loss of life, in some cases involving the excessive use of force by the police. And thousands of demonstrators and police themselves have been wounded. The Duque government is partnering with the Attorney General to swiftly investigate these tragic episodes and to bring accountability. It's also convened an important national dialogue with protest leaders. And it appears earlier this week, some informal pre-agreements have been reached with youth leaders that provide renewed hope for the future. I know I speak for everyone in saying we all hope for success in this dialogue effort and the democratic process. And back here, we should all work together in a bipartisan way to recommit our friendship and assistance to Colombia in their time of need. So let's get on with today's discussion. To those who are watching today's event, we are reserving time later on in the hour to take questions from the audience. You can add them in the chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen or tweet them using hashtag DuqueDC. Make sure to include your name and affiliation. Mr. President, thank you again for joining us in this conversation. I would now like to introduce and turn it over to my friend, Michael Shifter, President of the Inter-American Dialogue, who will ask the first question. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Green, and good morning and muy buenos días, todos y a todas. I want to thank the Wilson Center and you, Ambassador, for partnering with the dialogue in this very important and timely event. I also want to thank the embassy for its cooperation and confianza. President Duque, allow me to join Ambassador Green in welcoming you and thanking you for accepting our invitation. As you know, the dialogue has been privileged to host you on various occasions, both during your campaign and during your administration. Frankly, and in a very constructive spirit, this moment is quite different from the others. As Ambassador Green said, quite dramatic and worrying in many respects. Colombia is now in the midst of considerable turmoil that is not seen in many years. The perception in many quarters, including Washington, is that the government has been struggling to deal effectively with the current crisis. There hasn't really been a well thought out strategy to get the situation under control. Declining poll numbers also suggest many Colombians are unhappy with your leadership. We all condemn violence, vandalism, destruction of property, and disruption in economic activity that harms millions of Colombians. But the bulk of protesters seem to have legitimate grievances, some longstanding and others a product of the current economic and health crisis. There have been credible reports of troubling human rights abuses by security forces, and your administration's attempt at dialogue, as Ambassador Green noted, while welcome, seem inadequate to match the urgency of the moment. The questions are, what do you understand to be fueling such widespread discontent and unrest in Colombia? How do you explain what's going on? Does your administration bear some responsibility for the growing disenchantment? Do you regret anything about how you've responded to the protests to date? And do you think that 1 month after Colombia has exploded, triggered by an unpopular tax reform proposal, a course correction is needed?
Well, thank you so much. First of all, let me express my gratitude to Ambassador Mark Green, who has been a great friend of Colombia. And thank you for your kind words and objectivity that has always defined you, Ambassador Green. Also, I want to express my welcome to our good friend, Michael Shifter. And let me begin by saying the following, Michael. It's always important to put the things in context of where we were, where we are, and where we are heading to. Because it's always important to recognize that Colombia has had over the years many accumulated social debts. And actually, when I ran for the presidency, one of the main goals that I proposed to the Colombian people was to close social gaps. I inherited an economy that was growing at 1.7%, and I inherited a fiscal deficit that was almost around 50%. By the end of 2019, we were one of the economies that was growing at the highest level in Latin America. We were able to raise tax collections, and we have the lowest fiscal deficit in almost 7 years. We had, for the first time, a primary fiscal surplus within the last 8 years. And we started 2020 with a growth in January and February that was above 4%. Those things were very important because we were moving along a recovery that was much needed in the country. Nevertheless, we all had to face the pandemic, an invisible enemy that came and hit the whole world. And the pandemic basically had several impacts, not only on Colombia, but on different countries. So we're talking about the impact it had on the economy. We had a major recession last year. The pandemic also affected the global economy in a very severe way. And we saw the fall down of all the prices in terms of oil and other commodities that affected national finances of many emerging economies. We saw how it impacted the labor market. And obviously in our case, it was also severely affected. And we had to deal with such a threat. And we did it in a way that we combined a whole set of instruments that allowed us to duplicate our ICU capacity. We also made the biggest social safety net program ever in Colombian history. We were able to provide non-conditional cash transfers to almost 3.5 million families around the country. We were able to subsidize the payroll of almost 3.5 million workers. We also provided extraordinary income to more than 2.7 million elder people in the country. And we were able to provide resources to Familias en Acción and Jóvenes en Acción, which are conditional cash transfers that have had a historical impact in the country. And besides that, we launched the equivalent of the Colombian New Deal in July last year, so that we would have public-private investment of more than $40 billion to get the economy running. So we passed through 2020 with all these main challenges, and we arrived in 2021 with something that was very important. And we saw it in the first trimester. Colombia had in the first trimester a growth of 1.1% above any expectation. And the economy was aimed to grow this year above 5%. We also were very clear that the country had to massively vaccinate, and we're getting close to 10 million people vaccinated in the country, so we can reach the goal of 35 million people. But we understood as well that the things that we had to face in terms of fiscal capacity ought to be addressed also in 2021, so that we would continue protecting the poorest of the poor and be able to consolidate the social safety net. So it's important to say that we did, in fact, present a reform before Congress, a reform that had a massive social transformation in Colombia that would allow the 50% of the population with lowest income to have an income in times of crisis and be able to defeat extreme poverty over the course of 3 years. But obviously, we know that there was a call on strike made 2 months before. And I think we could have committed. And I think we in fact have to recognize that we were not effective enough to address many of the distortions that were created. And that's why we decided to withdraw it and try to build a bigger consensus. But we need to protect the people in need in Colombia. And obviously, what we're seeing today, it's a situation where there are multiple phases. We see the phase of those who are genuinely and peacefully protesting in the streets because, yes, they have been affected by the pandemic, and that's the case of the youngsters and women. But we also have seen the phase of extreme violence, vandalism, the destruction of public infrastructure, and also, in some places, the influence of armed groups who are promoting that kind of conduct to create uncertainty. And yes, those circumstances have to be addressed with law and order. But let me be very clear, Michael. Since day one of my administration, I have said we are a supporter of all the forces of law and order. But we have said since day one that there's a zero tolerance policy if a member of the military or the police goes beyond the law. And we have acted that way. And especially, we have to recognize that the Colombian police performs on an annual basis more than 30 million police procedures. And yes, are there cases of abuse? Yes, they are, as there are in any city of the United States, but they are investigated and they are sanctioned, and they're sanctioned promptly. And we work with the Attorney General's office, with the Procurator General and the Ombudsperson's office so that those investigations take place, because the zero tolerance policy was presented since day one of my administration. And we also have to recognize that even if we're facing times of turbulency, we have to also address that as of today, and almost reaching 3 years of my administration, we have the lowest homicide rate maybe in the last 7 or 8 administrations. And we have done that because we believe that protecting human rights and protecting life, it's so important for the Colombian people. And we know the young people in Colombia have necessities, and we have to address it. But we also have to be clear that those cases of vandalism have to be faced with law and order. We also have to recognize that there's something that we hadn't seen before in Colombia in the way we have seen in the last weeks in some parts of the country, which are the blockades. Blockades that have affected the supply of food, the supply of oxygen, the supply of vaccines, and they simply are a crime under Colombian legislation. So we have to recognize that that's not a peaceful way to express any sentiment, and we have to protect the rights of all. But we also have to recognize that we're also in a pre-electoral years, and that's another phase. So there are people that might want to capture the sense of chaos, or they want to build their aspirations based on chaos. So it's a multiple phase situation, but I think we are trying to address it in a clear and transparent way. And let me begin by saying that on the youngsters, for example, we have already launched, what is the most ambitious program ever on public education in terms of university. We're providing free public university, technical and technological university for kids that are of the poorest of the poor families and are on the middle class. And that's a non-precedented program that began last year, and we're now going to extend it as a state policy. But we also understood, listening to the claims that they have expressed in different scenarios, that they want to have jobs. So that's why we have already launched a program that will begin on July the 1st, which is if you hire a young person between 18 and 28, we will subsidize the equivalent of the Social Security so they can be hired by the private sector or any other contractor. And that is something that is going to generate a positive impact. I should also mention that on that pact on the youth population, for the first time in a Latin American country, we're going to have free and open elections of the youth district councils, then that will happen in November. So we will have the local, the regional, and the national youth councils so that they can participate and involve themselves in policy making. And obviously, we have to do something bigger in terms of opportunity. And we launched a housing program because people between 18 and 28 are 18% of the Colombian population, but they represent 41% of the people that have bought low-income housing. And 50% of that 41% have received subsidies in our government. And we believe if we want to have a society of owners, we have to do something more aggressive. And we launched a program so that we will have the lowest interest rate ever in the housing market, 6.7%, with a loan to value loan of 90%. And something that is important, 70% of guarantees provided by the government, so that we also open the opportunities for that generation to become a generation of owners. So yes, we are not only addressing these needs, but we're also having the possibility to dialogue with many people in the country and many groups in the country, because this is not just a short-term measure. We have to see this as a crisis, yes, but also an opportunity. And the opportunity is that this year, 2021, has to be the year of massive vaccination, of safe recovery, of attending the youth needs, be able to attend the poorest of the poor, and stabilize our economy. Those are what we call the fundamental pact that we have to build this year, and we're going to put all our efforts to that. And yes, you mentioned the polls. The polls are always pictures. And I always said, if the polls are good, we work 3 times harder. If the polls go bad, we work 3 times harder, because this is something that we all have to consider. And I've seen it with many of my colleagues in Latin America. This is not time of popularity, but this is time for us to address the needs and be able to support and consolidate institutionality, democracy. And I think, yes, we have passed through many complicated times. Maybe this is a social explosion of sentiments, but we have to conduct those sentiments so that we can make this transformation in our country.
Thank you.
Mr. President, again, good to be with you. In some ways, I can't get away from my USAID background. What support is needed, do you think, from the international community to help implement your historic gesture of TPS for Venezuela? What should the international community be doing to help make the promise of this a full reality?
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Green. And I also want to, frame your question considering the situation that Colombia is living. Colombia has not just been affected by the pandemic. I think if it would be only the pandemic, well, that's one history to be told. But we are a country that is also at the same time and simultaneously facing the biggest migration crisis in the world. We have 1.8 million migrants in our soil at the same time where we're facing COVID-19 and its effects. And at the same time that we have been badly hit in last year by, for the first time, a hurricane category 5. And also affected by, as I say, long-term historical debts with different parts of the population. So we have to face this, recognizing what are the structural needs and what are the short-term needs. And you will ask, how can the international community support? You know this very well because you were not only a good friend, but an ally. And we've talked many times about this, Mark, and you know that when we talk about the migration crisis, what has been supported by the international community in the case of the Syrian crisis has been something close to $6,000 per migrant. When you look at what has happened in South Sudan, and we're talking about almost $2,000 per migrant. And when it comes to the Venezuelan crisis, what the countries have received from the international community not even gets to $300 per migrant. So yes, this puts a great pressure on our fiscal accounts, but we have done it because that's the right way to be, the right way to go, and being in the right side of history. But I think we definitely need to mobilize more resources from the international community. And you were the main donor to attend this need, Mark, when you were in USAID, and the US has been the main supporter of this, but we have to call for the international community to do much more. The second thing that is important is that we definitely need to mobilize more resources to face the investments that we have to do to close the social gaps. Because we at the same time are implementing our peace with legality policy at the same time that we face COVID-19 and its effects. So being able to get resources for longer term in better rates, it's something that is needed and focused on some specific projects to be able to address the needs of the Colombian population. But we also have to face something that is important. We need the multilateral system to be robusted, to be boosted. And that means, yes, we need to capitalize the IDB. We need to get the SDRs from the IMF and be able to link those SDRs with the needs of the countries. But we also need to have more resources at the World Bank in order to be rapidly dispersed. So that's something where the international community and US can play a leadership role. And something that I should also mention, and I have said this in many scenarios, we have to consider that emerging markets cannot be judged by rating agency with the eyes of the pre-pandemic conditions, because the pandemic ain't over. And this is going to take longer than we all expect. And we have to attend also the social needs, but we also have to keep our commitment with fiscal prudency and fiscal stability. But it's important that there's some message also from the US and other countries that certainly have an influence and say, for the time being, we have to face this with extraordinary measures and extraordinary eyes. And that means we cannot judge things with indicators that we had in a pre-pandemic condition, because there's going to be a major need by emerging markets in terms of raising debt in the following years. So that's something that has to be put on the table. And I was listening this morning to Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and she was saying, yes, but from Barbados, sorry. And she was saying that we definitely need to keep an eye on how do we enforce a multilateral response to these needs from different countries. And that involves the ones who are in more need, but also the middle income countries, because we need to get funding for the long term to attend some of these needs. And last but not least, and I should mention, the Pact for the Youth that we're trying to build in Colombia. It'll be great to have the support of USAID. It'll be great to have the support of the United Nations. And it will be great to have the support of the IDB and the World Bank, because this is not only short term. We want to allow youngsters in Colombia to have free public university education, attending the middle class and the poorest of the poor. But we also need to accelerate the program where we want to create at least 1 million jobs within the first year. Can that be done? Yes. And also US companies that are based in Colombia can play a very important role. And if we have USAID helping us identify those programs and accelerate the hiring of the young people, I think we're going to significantly make a difference.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, just building on Ambassador Green's question about the United States, I'd like to hear what you think about how you see the United States responding to the turmoil and unrest in Colombia specifically. Do you think you've seen some of the comments, you've seen some of the statements that have come out on executive branch and Congress? How do you see those statements? And also, you lived in Washington from when you and I met, when you were at the IDB from 2001 to 2013. Those are the years after Plan Colombia, talk of a strategic alliance between the United States and Colombia. Do you worry that that alliance is not quite as robust as it used to be? And does the current crisis perhaps contribute to that? What is your sense?
Well, I think it's always good, Michael, to see things in the right context, because you mentioned the word turmoil, you mentioned the word unrest, and I think we have faced in Colombia many times where we have seen expressions of violence and when we have seen expressions of the citizens among many issues. But I also believe that we have to identify what's really happening and how we can address this at the right way. Because you mentioned turmoil and unrest, but at the same time, when you mention turmoil and unrest, the country has passed a recession time with a growth that has surpassed many of other countries in Latin America in the first trimester. And we're also moving fast on massive vaccination. We just certainly reached the highest number yesterday. And we also have clear that nobody can believe that there's any Colombian who doesn't want the recovery to happen or the vaccination to happen. And that's why peaceful protest is something that is right and that we have to grant it and we have to protect it. Vandalism and blockades, those are conducts that are sanctioned by the Colombian legislation. And we have to unite our voice to say that those conducts violate the rights of the many. So it's good to separate those things, because on the peaceful protest, we will always grant and guarantee that right. In case of facing conducts against the rights of all citizens, we have to act with law and order, but always with zero tolerance on any violation of human rights, and also zero tolerance on any conduct that goes beyond the law. So I should mention this, because then the next part of your question is this just something that is happening in Colombia? We're living in a polarized world. I think the politics in the United States have never been so polarized as we have seen it in the last years. And the same thing is happening in Spain, and the same thing is happening in Italy, and the same thing is happening in France, where you see the yellow vests acting with violence on a frequently basis. And I think we all have to acknowledge that the worst thing that can happen is to see violence emerging as a response to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we all have to act. And I believe the United States is playing a very important role. And I'm happy to hear from the Biden administration the commitment that they have on building back better in terms of what comes after COVID-19, but also putting human rights also in the center of a very important debate internationally. And you ask me, is that alliance weakened? I don't think so at all, because Colombia and the United States will celebrate 200 years of bilateral relationship in 2022. And that relationship is not just centered on who the presidents are. I think it has gotten in such a mature level that it goes beyond the political cycles. And I think in the last 20 years, we saw what Plan Colombia meant to President Clinton and how he supported Plan Colombia. But we also saw President Bush accelerating a free trade agreement that has opened many opportunities for Colombians and for US investors. Then we saw the Obama administration commitment in supporting Colombia in many of the efforts to close social gaps. And the Trump administration was the #1 ally to face the migration crisis, but also to supporting us with the idea of making Colombia a leader in terms of nearshoring. And now we have seen the Biden administration expressing that they want to work with Colombia on the energy transition, that they want to work with Colombia promoting more investment, that they want to work with Colombia in order to have more trade exchange, but at the same time to be able to coordinate more efforts in human rights protection and building a lasting peace with legality policy. So I think those are great opportunities. And if you ask me, how can they help in the situation we live? I think now on the Pact for the Youth, definitely the US can play a very important role with USAID and also the US companies in Colombia to hire young people that have been affected by the pandemic. And I also believe that in terms of creating a fundamental pact on massive vaccination, the US can play a very important role. And we have requested the US to lend us at least 8 million vaccines from the excedents that the US has that we will give back once we get our contingents. But that can allow us to accelerate the vaccination program. And that's something that is very simple and clear where the US administration can support. And we have also expressed that in terms of a secure recovery, the nearshoring policy is something that can play a very important role, because that would allow us to open new opportunities for employment and for investment. So I think this is a great opportunity, and we want to build with the US administration, with the Biden administration, what we call a long-term action plan that goes beyond a decade, beyond the political cycles. So all these elements are together, including obviously with our joint efforts to fight crime and international crime and narco trafficking. But I think this is an opportunity, and we definitely think the United States can play a very important role in our country.
Mr. President, the only danger I face whenever I have a conversation with you is you keep jumping ahead and taking my questions before I can pose them to you. I was going to touch upon your thoughts on nearshoring. It's something that you've spoken about very eloquently, and it's particularly relevant right now in the US discussion as we think about great power competition, and we see restrictions and constraints in our supply chains as being one of the greatest hindrances potentially to rapid economic growth. If you could talk about that a little bit more, for what you see as the potential for nearshoring supply chains, moving in some cases from an Asian supply chain to something based in the Americas. If you could talk about that a little bit more. I think it's an important topic for all of us, both the US and Colombia, as we look ahead.
Well, thank you for that question, Ambassador Green. And I may say this, this year, we're going to be celebrating 60 years of the Alliance for Progress. And we have to go back to the fundamental idea that President Kennedy had with Latin America. When he created the Alliance for Progress, and I remember that Douglas Dillon was playing a very important role in the Treasury Department and later on the State Department. What they conceived at the moment was an opportunity where the US could invest, could bring talent, could contribute to building human capital in the Americas. And I think that was the most ambitious policy at the time that we had seen from the United States with Latin America. Even I think it was more centered on building relationships than the Monroe Doctrine. But time has passed. And I think the free trade agreements that were signed in the early 2000s were very important because they opened markets for the Latin American companies so that being close to market, they could sell to the United States, and that could be a trigger of economic growth and obviously building opportunities. But as of today, that's not enough, but it's complementary. So if the US now identifies what are the major challenges that are derived from Latin America, the US has to deal on a permanent basis with a migration pressure in the southern border of the United States. Now, can that be changed strategically? In my opinion, in my humble opinion, yes. How can that be changed? With a nearshoring policy. Why? Because instead of having so much concentrated industrial production in Asia and other parts of the world, being in the Americas, being close to market, having a competitive labor market, improving the cost of energy can also be an opportunity to fund an industrial base in Latin America, generate employment, reduce the pressure on the southern border, and be able to build lasting development impacts in the countries. If you ask me, in the case of Colombia, Colombia has a free trade agreement with the United States. If we just get 1% of what is going to potentially be nearshored in the Americas, that simply can open the opportunity to almost 2 million jobs within a 5-year framework. And that is transformational. Where can those investments be located? In the northern coast of Colombia, not only close to market, very competitive, energy prices coming down, having a transition in energy that is going to allow solar and wind to be part of that competitiveness, having the ports located there, and be able to connect through the Panama Canal to the west and the east coast of the United States. So I think nearshoring, very well planned, can substantially be, Ambassador Green, the next stage of an alliance with Latin America that will generate employment, will trigger growth, will reduce the pressure of the southern border, and definitely allow more US companies to build what we call aggregated value chains around the world. And I think that if there's a big commitment, bipartisan, bicameral, on this effort, this is going to be transformational in our region.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mr. President, we've gotten hundreds and hundreds of questions for this event. As won't surprise you, it's generated enormous interest, and really welcome your perspectives. One of the questions, there have been many people who have asked the same question, and I'd like to start by asking you. You've talked about some of the approaches that the government is pursuing to deal with the current circumstances, clearly dialogue, reaching out to youth and other groups, and also, maintaining order, which is obviously a central function of governments. The other approach is to try to engage perhaps the international community. And there is a lot of questions about a possible visit by the OAS's Human Rights Commission, Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, that seems to be very interested and ready to go to Colombia to look at the situation. And I think that they, wondering if you could sort of update us on that, if you expect to write a letter requesting that visit, and how you see the possible role of an outside, independent, professional group to really examine a lot of the complexities that and many faces, as you put it, of the current circumstances.
Thank you, Michael. Let me begin by saying that Colombia is a vibrant democracy, and it's a country of institutions, and it's a country of independent institutions. So we are not only committed to the protection of human rights, but we have always been transparent enough so that we can have the scrutiny not only from the entities in our country, but also from foreign entities. And I should remember that since 1996, we have the Office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights located in Colombia. We not only share programs with them, but we have an exchange of visions that is done on a permanent basis. We also have, by law, the creation of the Office of the Presidential High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we meet regularly with all the platform of human rights defenders. And Colombia has been not only a country that has played a very important role within the OAS as maybe the oldest democracy in the region, but we have also participated actively, not only inside the UN, the OAS Human Rights Commission, but also on the OAS Human Rights Court in Costa Rica. That tradition is very important to say, that we have always been open to have all the conversations with any international entity that is saying to the protection of human rights. But we also have said that the Ombudsperson's office, the Procurator General's office, and the Attorney General's office in Colombia have to do their job. So by saying this, we know what the fundamental responsibility is, what the complementary responsibility is, and obviously open to any kind of scrutiny that is based on an objective criteria. By saying that, I want to go into the weeds of your question, because have there been historically abuses by members of the force in Colombia? Yes, we have seen those cases, but something that is important is that the country has continuously evolved to make human rights one of the most important characteristics of the training that we have within the military and the police. And maybe some people during the situation have not mentioned this, Michael, but it is in this administration that we have called for a continuous human rights provision of training in all the academies in the army and the police, in all the levels of formation. That is something that is important. And as I mentioned, how many police procedures are performed in Colombia on an annual basis? More than 30 million. How many accusations of abuse have we received in the last years? We have seen years of 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 3,000. And that reflects that it's not a systemic conduct. But if it happens, the zero tolerance policy is immediately activated. And that's why we have seen not only investigations, but severe sanctions to people that have gone beyond the law. And I should mention an example. Last year, we saw in the United States what happened to George Floyd. We also remember years ago what happened to Rodney King. Last year, we had a very horrendous case in Bogota with Javier Ordóñez. And when you look pari passu on the time that took place in the George Floyd case to have a sentence, and the case of Javier Ordóñez to have a sentence and to have a criminal action, you can see how fast we acted. The Colombian authorities. Now, by saying that, we have to look every single day for the highest level of protection of human rights. And that is why I think it's also important to say this, Michael. It was my administration in the month of February this year that with the director of the National Police and the Ministry of Defense presented before Congress a reform to the Colombian police aimed so that the service that is performed in the streets on citizen security is based on elevating those standards at the highest levels. Body cams, be able to identify the name, the number, the badge of the officers, have a rigorous ballistic traceability policy that is working in many of the cities in Colombia, that we're going to extend it to the whole country. So that if somebody activates a weapon during the day, once he comes back to the office to give his gun because he's going home overnight, if there is one single element that the gun has been used, the traceability is acted immediately to know the circumstances where that gun was activated. So I think those elements are important, as it's also important to say that as of today, we have more than 80 investigations of potential abuses that could have been committed in the last 4 weeks. And that this is done with the Ombudsperson's office, with the Attorney General's office, with the Procurator General's office. And we have shared this information with any agency that wants to know how we have performed. And even if in potential investigations that could derive later on, only if there's not a response from the Colombian authorities, we also are able to share that information openly because we don't have nothing to hide. We're a democracy. We're in a country based in institutions. There's a zero tolerance policy, but there's always the sentiment that members of the army and the police are working day to day with the highest commitment to the protection of the citizens of all Colombians. And they have also been instructed that inside the institutions, there's also a zero tolerance policy. And something that I want to mention to end this comment, the army and the police, what we call the military justice in Colombia. The military justice has been transformed in this administration. My administration not only made the reform, but we made it independent. And we have now a council that is presided by the president of the Supreme Court of Colombia. And we also want to make the military justice fast, effective, and be very clear to any scrutiny when they are doing their job on things that happen in the course of the service.
Thank you.
Mr. President, as Michael mentioned, we've gotten a ton of questions. I'm going to combine a couple here. So can you give us the latest updates from the demonstrations that we've seen in terms of deaths and what you know on injuries, together with any progress that you can reveal for us on the ongoing dialogue with youth leaders? What's the latest that you're able to share with us?
Something that is important to say, Mark, is that overall, we can say that the protests that we have seen in Colombia have been, in a vast majority, they have been peaceful. And we have to recognize that that is a genuine expression from the citizens that we respect, that we have to protect. That is very important. We also have to say that we have seen very complicated acts of violence in some of those protests, and there were vandalism. We saw the destruction of public goods. We saw attacks on public servants. And yes, we have seen people that have been injured from the civilian population, but we have also seen people that have been badly injured that are members of the force. Now, we have to reject any form of violence. And we have to be clear that there has to be an investigation on what happened to the civilians, but also what happened to the officers that have been defending the Colombian Constitution and have been defending the institutions. We have seen cases of people that have died, and we have been very clear, not only with the police, but with the Attorney General's office that performs those investigations, so that they are not only clearly determine the circumstances on which those things happen. And yes, they have said that out of the number that was described initially, we have seen something close to 17 cases that might have a linkage of confrontations between the police and people who were undertaking wrongdoings. But it will be irresponsible from my side to say or make any judgment until the Attorney General's office doesn't resolve this, but we want to see that resolved very soon. We even have introduced investigations to members of the police that are underway on the military justice and also by the Attorney General's office if there's any abuse. But we have to be clear that we support the Colombian military and the Colombian police, but we always demand from them the highest human rights protection standards. And in terms of people that have, for example, been called as disappeared, which is a very complicated statement, what we have seen by the Attorney General's office and the Ombudsperson's office is that information that has been received with enough guarantees to have traceability, they basically demonstrate that many of those people have been identified and they know where they are. We're also seeing a number of people with incomplete information, and that has made more complicated that traceability. But it is our determination to have a clear response on that, because we don't want to have any minimum doubt that there's a zero tolerance if those cases take place. So we definitely are working in those investigations. That's my commitment. That's a commitment of my administration, but it's also our commitment to human rights protection in the country. And something that I should also mention, the blockades and the attacks that we have seen, for example, 2 days ago, to a justice palace in a municipality in Colombia. That simply cannot be tolerated. There were expedients that were destroyed. And that question is, who might be interested in destroying those expedients so that the justice cannot be made? What the attacks we saw on the Attorney General's office in Popayán, that was not a peaceful protest. There were guns that were stolen. There were expedients that were burned. And there was drug that was confiscated that was taken out. So in those specific places, we know, and that in those cases, there has been criminal activities that they have to be investigated. And we have made captures with the Attorney General's office of members of armed groups that already have proofs that they were giving money for people to go and have those acts of vandalism and to participate in those activities. So that's why this is a multi-phase situation where we have to act without generalizing, without stigmatizing, but be able to determine which are the conducts in a specific case.
Mr. President, if I can real quickly, if you can, any updates on the youth dialogue that you would like to share?
Yes, I think this is important, Mark, because definitely we have to build trust, and definitely we have to listen. Both sides have to listen. And we have been working with the ICBF, which is our institution that works on childhood and young attention in the country. We also have been working with the office, the Presidential Office for Youth, and we have been working with mayors and governors to create these roundtables. We have more than 100 already taking place, where we have gotten information, sentiments, proposals, and claims from almost more than 1,000 young representatives. We all know that in some cases there's a lot of mistrust that has to be managed with the help of universities and maybe the UN. But I think in a nutshell, what we have seen is that there is a great opportunity to have a pact for the youth population in Colombia. We were working to launch in June this year what we call the Compass, which is the policy, long-term policy document, where we have fiscal plans and development objectives. And I said, okay, let's hold it on for a second and let's enrich that document with the proposals that we can get from these tables. And we're thinking that maybe by the end of this first semester, we could have that document that is going to be the compass for the youth policy in the next years. And it's not only about resources, but our 4 criteria, or 5 or 6, that are substantial. The one that I mentioned on free university education for the lowest income families and the middle class. The second, to have the election of the youth councils this year. The third, to have the employment program where we subsidize 20% of the payroll equivalent of the Social Security for people that hire youngsters between 18 and 28. And I should mention also the opportunities for housing and also for entrepreneurship, plus the interventions on sports, culture, creativeness, and something that has emerged in the tables, mental health. Because we also have to acknowledge, Mark and Michael, that the young population not only has been affected in terms of job opportunities, they have also been affected because they have been at home for more than a year. And in the conversations that I've had with some of the young leaders, what they say is, you know, Mr. President, I have been 2 semesters in the university and I don't know who my classmates are. And I really want to have, again, that possibility of socializing. And some have lost their jobs and some are finding opportunities. And I should say this, if we have to say at a certain moment, if we're sorry with that population, maybe because we haven't had the opportunity to listen to them as we should have in the midst of the pandemic, I think we all have to say it. And it's not just the president, or the governors, the mayors, the private sector, everyone. And this is not something that is happening in Colombia. Maybe we're seeing the explosion right now, but it might take place in the United States soon or in other places. And I think this is a call that, yes, we were facing the pandemic. Yes, we were trying to address the social safety net. But I think at this moment, we have to do something very ambitious for the young population in Colombia. And I think these roundtables are giving us that opportunity. Now, all the peoples in the roundtable represent everybody who's in the street? Maybe not. But it's a mechanism to listen, to build, and to be able to launch this great pact for the young population in Colombia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
President Duque, on behalf of Ambassador Green, the Wilson Center, and the Inter-American Dialogue, we want to thank you for joining us for this conversation, which I think has been very frank and informative at a very critical, sensitive moment. And I think we can all agree that sort of the best approach is always being with good friends, being honest and straightforward. And I think that helps both of us, and it helps deepen understanding and also deepening a partnership, which we greatly value between as friends and also between our countries. And we're certainly going to work to do everything to advance that partnership and that relationship, which has been so critical. These are challenging times for all of us, and we really think that this conversation has been extremely valuable, and we appreciate your frankness and taking time from your very busy schedule and all that's going on in Colombia to share your thoughts and perspectives with us this morning. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you so much, Ambassador Green. It has been a great honor for me to participate this morning, and I hope to visit you soon in Washington, D.C. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.